Hey Ohio, it's October 23rd, 2025. Today I want to talk about two bills that passed out of our House yesterday. They have to do with property tax reform, and those are HB 335 and HB 186. These bills will now move on to the Senate, and if they pass out of the Senate, they'll have to be signed by Governor DeWine to become law. But I think it's really important that we understand these bills and kind of the big picture of what's going on here. Before I jump into those individual bills, we need to know some foundational things. One is, how do we fund public schools in the state of Ohio? They are funded through our state budget, okay, through our general revenue fund, which is mainly filled with income tax dollars and sales tax dollars. And then they're also funded through property taxes. Again, state budget, property taxes is how we fund our public schools in this state. Now, over time, the state share of funding for our public schools has decreased. That percentage has decreased substantially. It used to be just several years ago 47% that they would contribute. Now it's down to 36% that they contribute through the state funding, and it's projected to be about 32% in the next couple of years. So their share has declined in the last several years regarding how much they contribute through our state budget to public school education. And even when it was 47%, this was ruled unconstitutional because it forced districts to rely too heavily on property tax dollars. And again, they've just decreased that share over time. Just for some perspective, we are 45th lowest in the nation in the state share of funding for public schools, okay? And so what happens when over time the state share of public school funding decreases? Well, it just shifts the burden onto property taxes, right? And we've seen that. We've seen that in Ohio. Property taxes are high, and most recently, property taxes went through the roof for some people. So we need to talk about that and why that happened. And so before we jump in, I'm going to talk about, well, how do we calculate property taxes? Property taxes are calculated by something called your assessed home value, okay? Assessed home value is simply when your county auditor every 6 years does a reappraisal of your home to determine its worth. There's a mini appraisal that happens every 3 years. They take that amount times 35%, that's your assessed home value. And then you take that times something called millage rate. Mills are just taxes, they're property taxes. So 10 mills equals 1%. And millage rate is calculated by inside and outside millage. Outside millage are taxes that you vote on, right? As a constituent, when they put a levy on the ballot, your public school, police, fire department, they put a levy on the ballot, that is considered outside millage, okay? Inside millage are taxes that are not voted on, right? Every like local government, municipality, what have you, they have a 10 mil guarantee where they can use 10 mils towards this property tax equation that they don't have to get approved from the voters. And so that's the inside millage here. So again, when you add these up, you divide it by 1,000 and you take it times the home value, you get your property taxes. Now, recently, when homes were reappraised by auditors across the state, home values shot up. They went through the roof. And that's because it was the first time they were reappraising a lot of these homes since the COVID pandemic. There were so many factors during COVID or the COVID pandemic that led to property values going through the roof, inflation, supply-demand mismatch. We've seen a huge increase in private equity corporations backed by private equity buying up thousands of homes across the state of Ohio, which guess what that does? It takes an affordable home off the market for a single family, and it drives up prices for everybody because it decreases the supply, drives up demand, prices go up, home values are reassessed higher, okay? And so everybody saw the property taxes increase based on home values going up. Now, some people saw their property taxes go really high. Why is that? It has to do with something called HB 920. So back in the 1970s, we had a similar situation in Ohio where inflation was high, home values were going up, people were going, hey, our wages aren't going up, my home value's up, or we're getting taxed out of our homes. So the state legislature came in and they did HB 920. It's a property tax reduction valve. What it does is this side of the equation, so if you use like the distributive property here in math, this assessed home value times this, what it does is it reduces that. So say the home value went up by 20%. It wouldn't allow this portion of the equation to go up by 20%. It would reduce that back to the level that was voted on initially by the voters. So that's what HB 920 does. It's a safety valve. Now, around the same time, they said, but wait, if we do that, we're worried that certain schools are not going to have the funding they need to continue operating. And so they created something called the 20 mil floor. The 20 mil floor is where school districts are guaranteed 20 mils of this property tax equation so they can continue running and providing services to students and educating kids. Now, districts that are at that 20 mil floor, meaning they're not above that 20 mil floor, they don't get HB 920. They don't get that property tax reduction valve. So most recently, when home values went up by 20, 25, 30%, they saw that increase on their outside and their inside millage. Okay, so their property taxes spiked really high because they didn't get the HB 920 reduction valve. So people were mad. People are like, this is out of control. Our property taxes are too high. And they're right. In the state of Ohio, our property taxes are extremely high. But again, zooming out, big picture, why? It's because we have created a situation, by we, I mean the majority party in our state house that has been in control for the last 20 years. They've created a system in which they have paid less of their fair share towards things like the local government fund and public schools. So then that shift has gone on to property taxes for those local communities to raise revenue to run those things, okay? Well, enter these bills. So our state legislature said, okay, we're going to do something about this. We're going to try to get property taxes down for people. Great, I agree. This is what we need to be focusing on. So let's talk about the bills that just passed out of our House. HB 186. This bill, what it essentially does is it uses this part of the equation, okay, the assessed home value times the outside millage, and it doesn't allow this part of the equation to go up in lockstep with increasing home values. It reduces that to the level of inflation. This is for people that are at or below that 20 mil floor, okay, that don't get this HB 920, the people that saw the bigger spike, right, in their property taxes. So that's that. HB 335 affects inside millage, okay? So it's this portion of the equation, right? So it's saying, okay, if a home value goes up by 20%, we're not gonna allow this to go up in lockstep with that. We're gonna, again, reduce this part of the equation down to the level of inflation. On their surface, these don't seem like bad bills, right? I think anybody that with common sense is like, well, yeah, that's reasonable. We don't want to see giant spikes. However, they have introduced these and passed these and said, look, we're saving property taxpayers $2.4 billion in the state of Ohio. Well, who is losing that $2.4 billion in the state of Ohio? It's local communities, it's schools, it's, all of those local services. And we saw people come from school districts across the state to say, we're worried. We understand that property taxes are too high, but we are in a position where if we don't have revenue from property taxes, how are we going to keep operating? And a lot of the legislators that question these people that came from school districts said, well, you're gonna, basically have to figure it out, or, you have to look at your spending. And somebody from the Springboro, the treasurer from the Springboro school district spoke, and she was like, listen, we are already spending, we are the 11th lowest per pupil spending in our district. We are financially responsible. We, have large classroom sizes already. You can come look at our books. And they were like, well, sorry, I just feel like it was such a slap in the face to so many of those districts that came out and said, we're worried. We understand people are mad about this property tax going high, but you're not giving us more funding. Like, you haven't provided more of your share through the state budget that has led to this situation that we're in right now. And so it's frustrating, and I want to take a little bit of a step back and talk about the bipartisan fair school funding plan. For those of you that don't know, the bipartisan fair school funding plan was a piece of legislation that passed out of our state house about 4 years ago. And it was a bill. It was a bipartisan, meaning it had support of both sides of the aisle, bipartisan effort to finally predictably and equitably fund our public schools across the state. It used multiple different data inputs, and it had a 6-year rollout, and it rolled out in 2-year chunks. So every 2-year budget, 2 more, it basically would roll out a little bit more. And we were in the last 2 years of it rolling out when our majority party state lawmakers decided, we don't want to honor this in its entirety. They did a watered down formula of this that didn't account for cost increases, right? Which face schools, right? Just like everybody else is feeling cost increases, schools are like, we feel those too. We feel those increases. And they're like, no, we're not going to update those costs. It ended up, because they did not fully implement this in its entirety with updated inputs, it costs districts across the state a ton of money. Some districts, tens of millions of dollars, which just goes to show their dedication or their responsibility towards funding public education in our state is not serious. They would rather, which they did in the state budget, they would rather give an income tax cuts income tax cut to the wealthiest people in the state. That's what they did in our state budget. They underfunded public schools, a lot of public schools, and then they gave an income tax cut to the wealthiest people in the state. And this is in addition to the $12 billion in tax expenditures that we give away basically every year to the wealthy, the well-connected, special interests in this state, when we could be using that money to appropriately fund public schools through our state budget, paying the fair share through our state budget, so that those local communities don't have to rely so heavily on property tax dollars. So that is kind of big picture here. So again, they're being so self-congratulatory about these things, but everybody needs to understand there are implications of this. And yes, we need property taxes to go down, but we absolutely, at the end of the day, need our state, through our state budget, to pay more of their fair share for these local services, to their local government fund, through public school funding, etc. There's a couple of property tax bills that I really support, and I wish we would hear these in our state house, and I'm curious to see if they are going to be heard and passed. And those are something called the property tax circuit breaker and the homestead exemption. These bills will give targeted property tax relief to people in Ohio, the ones that need it the most. So property tax circuit breaker is where people, if the property taxes start taking up a too high of a portion of that person's income, it comes in and caps that, and the state comes in and picks up the rest of that amount, so that local community doesn't lose out on that property tax revenue. But again, key point here is being the state has to pay a share of that. And so we'll see what they do with this, the majority party. And then the homestead exemption is where people age 65 and older and people with disabilities get a break on their property taxes. We already have a homestead exemption, but there's an income cap, so you can only get it if you make below $42,000 a year. I think that should be substantially increased. But again, in order to do that, the state has to come in and pay the rest of that revenue to the local community. And I'm very curious to see what they do with this. But these would give targeted property tax relief to people without shorting funding for local schools, community services, etc. So we'll see where this goes. And then, in the backdrop of all of this is a ballot initiative where a citizen-led ballot initiative where people want to abolish property taxes, which I've talked about in several videos, would be devastating. I mean, it would throw our state into an economic tailspin. And it's one of the reasons that I think lawmakers have been, obviously they are trying to go, we need to fix property taxes, because if this happens, I mean, we're donezo. It's going to be bad. And I know a lot of people will come in my comments and say, no more property taxes, but I've done plenty of videos explaining why that would be bad. But at the end of the day, again, when we're talking about lowering property taxes, unless that comes along with the state picking up their share of funding for things, for local services, those local communities are just going to have to scramble. And a lot of schools are going to have to cut things like teachers, busing, which they're already struggling in a lot of districts to pay for. So just a little overview. We'll see where these bills go. Again, they go on to the Senate next. I hope it was informative, and I'll keep everybody posted.